The silver ink seemed to absorb the firelight rather than reflect it, creating an effect most unsettling, as though the words themselves existed in summels, existed in some dimension slightly removed from the paper that held them. Holmes studied the document with that absolute stillness that came over him when his mind was working at its highest capacity, his eyes moving across every millimetre of the page, reading not merely the obvious message, but the countless subtle details that would escape ordinary observation. I watched him examine the paper's texture between his long fingers, holding it up to catch the light from different angles, bringing it close to his aquiline nose to detect any scent that might cling to the fibres. Professor Blackwood sat motionless in his chair, the brandy forgotten in his hand, his breathing shallow and quick with barely suppressed anxiety. Outside, a carriage passed, its wheels splashing through puddles, the horse's hooves creating a rhythm that faded gradually into the distance until only the rain remained. "The paper is modern," Holmes said at last, his voice cutting through the tension like a scalpel through silk. "Manufactured within the last decade, I should say. Probably purchased from any of a dozen stationers here in London. The ink, however, is another matter entirely." He moved to his chemical bench by the window, that cluttered workspace where he conducted his endless experiments, and selected a small glass vial and a dropper. "With your permission, Professor." Blackwood nodded mutely, and Holmes applied a single drop of clear liquid to the corner of the paper, watching intently as it spread slightly through the fibres. Fascinating. The ink contains actual silver particles suspended in a gum Arabic base. An old formula, very old indeed, though the silver itself is recently refined. Someone has gone to considerable trouble to recreate a medieval ink recipe using modern materials. He set the paper down on the bench and turned to face our visitor, his expression thoughtful. "Tell me, Professor, these deaths you mentioned, the first two, what were the circumstances?" Blackwood seemed to gather himself, sitting straighter in the chair, the brandy glass now gripped with both hands, as though it might anchor him to the present moment. "The first victim was a man named Thomas Ashford, a collector of medieval manuscripts. He was found in his library, surrounded by his books, with no mark upon him save for a small silver moth painted on his forehead. The doctor declared it heart failure. He was 68 after all, and not in the best of health. But Mr. Holmes, in the journal from 1323, there is an entry describing the death of one Thomas, keeper of sacred texts, found among his treasured volumes when the moth's wings brushed his brow. The second death," Blackwood continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "occurred 3 nights ago. A woman named Catherine Holbrook, a scholar of medieval art, who had recently published a paper on symbolism in 14th century mystical movements. She was found in her study at the British Museum, where she worked as a curator. Again, no violence, no apparent cause, simply a heart failure. And again, the silver moth, this time painted on her palm, as though she had reached out to receive something." Holmes had begun to pace, his hands clasped behind his back, his shadow elongating and contracting as he moved in and out of the firelight's reach. And in the journal, was there a corresponding entry? There was. Catherine of the Painted Visions, who sought to capture divine truth in earthly images, shall receive the moth's blessing upon her seeking hand. Mr. Holmes, the parallels are too precise to be coincidence. Someone is using these 600-year-old prophecies as a script for murder. A gust of wind rattled the windows, causing the curtains to stir slightly where they did not quite meet, and the fire flared briefly before settling back into its steady consumption of coal. I moved to pour myself a small measure of brandy, my mind racing with the implications of what we were hearing. The idea that someone might be enacting murders based on medieval texts was disturbing enough, but the precision, the attention to symbolic detail, suggested a mind both intelligent and profoundly disturbed. Holmes ceased his pacing and stood before Professor Blackwood, his gaze intense but not unkind. "These journals you discovered, who else has had access to them?" "I have been extraordinarily careful," Blackwood replied. "The materials are kept in a locked room at the college, accessible only to myself and my research assistant, a young man named David Thornhill. He has been with me for 2 years, impeccable credentials, utterly trustworthy. Beyond the two of us, only the college master knows of the discovery, and he has shown no interest in the actual contents." "And yet someone knows," Holmes said softly. "Someone knows not merely that these documents exist, but has studied them closely enough to extract specific details about these predicted deaths. Someone who possesses both the silver ink formula and the will to use it in service of murder, or at least something that has been made to appear as murder." He returned to his chair, settling into it with a fluid grace that spoke of deep familiarity, and reached for his pipe. The ritual of filling it, tamping the tobacco, striking the match, all of it performed with the unhurried precision of long habit. The first fragrant smoke curled upward toward the ceiling, adding another layer to the room's complex atmosphere of scent and warmth and sheltered safety. "I should like to see these journals," Holmes said, the pipe stem between his teeth slightly muffling his words. "Tomorrow, if arrangements can be made. And I should like to know everything you can tell me about the Silver Moth Society's beliefs and practices. But tonight, Professor Blackwood, you must tell me, why have you been chosen as the third victim? What connects you to Thomas Ashford and Catherine Holbrook beyond your shared interest in medieval history?" The professor's face had gone pale, making the shadows beneath his eyes more pronounced. He set down his brandy glass on the small table beside his chair with exaggerated care, as though afraid his trembling hands might cause him to drop it. "That is what terrifies me most, Mr. Holmes. I knew them both. Not well, but we moved in the same circles, attended the same conferences, corresponded about our research. Ashford had written to me just before his death, expressing interest in seeing the silver moth materials. Catherine Holbrook and I had collaborated on a paper 5 years ago, examining the intersection of mystical societies and artistic movements in the 14th century. The fire popped loudly, startling all three of us from our respective contemplations. A coal rolled forward in the grate, and I rose to push it back with the poker, the metal ringing softly against the iron. The rain had intensified again, drumming now against the windows with greater insistence, and somewhere in the building I heard a door close with a soft thud. "There is more," Blackwood said, and something in his tone made me turn from the fireplace to look at him. "The journal entry that I believe corresponds to my own predicted death. It describes the third victim as the seeker who opened the sealed chamber and brought forth what should have remained hidden. Mr. Holmes, I am the one who discovered the hidden room. I am the one who brought the Society's secrets back into the light. According to the prophecy, I am meant to die because I disturbed their rest." Holmes drew on his pipe, the tobacco glowing bright orange in the dimness, then released a long stream of smoke. "Prophecies," he said quietly, "are curious things. They can only be fulfilled if someone knows of them and chooses to act. This is not fate, Professor. This is murder, carefully disguised as mystical inevitability. Someone wants you to believe you are doomed, wants you to feel that same terror that Thomas Ashford and Catherine Holbrook must have felt when they realized what was happening to them." "Then you believe they knew," I interjected. "The first two victims, they knew they were marked for death?" "I believe that is highly probable, Watson. Consider, the killer takes the time to paint the symbol on his victims. This is not merely about causing death, but about creating fear, about making the victims complicit in their own demise through the power of suggestion and terror. A man frightened enough, convinced his death is inevitable and mystically ordained, might indeed suffer the heart failure that appears natural to a cursory examination." The professor had risen from his chair and moved to the window, pulling aside the curtain to stare out at the rain-soaked street below. "You are suggesting," he said slowly, "that these people were, in essence, frightened to death? I am suggesting it is a possibility worth considering, but we shall not know for certain until we have examined the evidence more thoroughly. The journals, the bodies, if they can be exhumed, the circumstances surrounding each death, all of it must be studied with the utmost care." Holmes stood, moving to stand beside the professor at the window. "I can promise you this, Edmund Blackwood. You will not become the third victim. Whatever forces are at work here, whether human malice or something more obscure, we shall uncover them and bring them into the light where they can be properly understood." From the street below came the sound of the watch calling out the hour, 11 o'clock and a rainy night. The words floated up through the darkness, another small thread in the tapestry of London's evening sounds. Somewhere a dog barked, then fell silent. The gas lamp nearest our window guttered slightly in the wind, casting wavering shadows across the pavement. Holmes turned from the window, his decision made. "You shall stay here tonight, in our spare room. Mrs. Hudson will not object, and I shall feel easier knowing you are under this roof where I can ensure your safety. Tomorrow we journey to Cambridge to examine these journals of yours, and in the meantime I shall send telegrams to several associates who might provide insight into medieval mystical practices and the chemistry of silver-based inks. Watson, if you would be so good as to prepare the guest room." I nodded, already moving toward the door, but Holmes's voice stopped me. "And Watson, bring your service revolver when you return. If someone has gone to this much trouble to create an atmosphere of mystical doom, they may not appreciate our interference in their carefully constructed drama." The hallway beyond our sitting room seemed darker than usual, the shadows deeper, though I told myself it was merely the effect of the conversation weighing upon my mind. I climbed the stairs to the small room we kept for occasional guests, my footsteps muffled by the worn carpet runner, and set about making the bed with fresh linens from the cupboard. Through the thin walls I could hear the murmur of voices from below. Holmes questioning, Blackwood answering, the two of them beginning the long process of extracting every detail that might prove relevant to the case. When I returned downstairs, my revolver secure in my jacket pocket, I found that Holmes had spread several maps across the table, their edges held down by books and a brass telescope. Blackwood was pointing to a location in Northumberland describing the manor house where he had made his discovery, while Holmes made notes in his neat, precise hand. Morning arrived, with reluctant grey light filtering through London's perpetual veil of coal smoke and mist, the rain having finally exhausted itself sometime in the small hours before dawn. I woke to find Holmes already dressed and standing at the window of our sitting room, his silhouette sharp against the pale luminescence of the sky, a cup of tea cooling forgotten in his hand. He had not slept. This much was evident from the scattered papers on the table, the full ashtray beside his chair, the 3 different books lying open at various pages, as though he had been cross-referencing some obscure detail through the night. Professor Blackwood emerged from the guest room, looking somewhat restored by rest, though the worry lines around his eyes had not diminished. Mrs. Hudson, bless her practical Scottish soul, had already laid out breakfast in the dining room. Kippers and eggs, toast with marmalade, a large pot of strong tea that sent fragrant steam curling through the air. The smell of it mingled with the lingering pipe smoke and the faint mustiness of the old books Holmes had been consulting, creating an atmosphere that was, in its own peculiar way, deeply comforting. "We shall take the 10 o'clock train to Cambridge," Holmes announced without preamble, not turning from the window. "I have sent word ahead to ensure we have access to the college archives. Watson, you will accompany us, I trust. Your medical expertise may prove invaluable if we are to understand the precise mechanism of these deaths." I assured him of my participation, while helping myself to the kippers, which were excellent, perfectly smoked, and still warm. Blackwood picked at his food with little appetite, his gaze drifting frequently to the window, as though expecting to see something ominous materialize from the morning fog. The tea was poured, dark and strong, into the good china cups that Mrs. Hudson reserved for mornings when she sensed something significant was afoot. Holmes finally abandoned his vigil at the window and joined us at the table, though he consumed only tea and a single piece of toast, his mind clearly occupied with matters beyond mere sustenance. "I spent the night," he said, settling into his chair with the cup cradled in both hands, researching the historical context of secret societies in the 14th century. The Silver Moth Society, while obscure, was not unique in its mystical inclinations. That period saw an explosion of such groups: alchemists, Kabbalists, Christian mystics seeking direct communion with the divine. The Church viewed them with suspicion, naturally, but many operated openly enough, at least initially. He paused to sip his tea, his eyes distant with thought. "What interests me, particularly, is the manner of their disappearance. Professor Blackwood, you said that, in 1324, all mention of them simply ceases. No trials for heresy, no records of persecution, no explanation whatsoever. They vanished as though they had never existed." Blackwood nodded slowly, setting down his fork with a soft clink against the china. "It is one of the great mysteries I hoped to solve through the discovered archives. The final entries in the journals become increasingly apocalyptic in tone, speaking of a great transformation that was to occur, a moment when those with silver souls would transcend the boundaries of mortal flesh. And then, nothing. The last dated entry is March 23rd, 1324. After that, blank pages. A church bell tolled somewhere in the distance, its sound muffled by fog and the intervening buildings, marking the hour of 9. We had time still before our departure, but I could sense Holmes's impatience to be moving, to be gathering data, rather than sitting in theoretical contemplation. He drained his teacup in 2 quick swallows and stood, already mentally shifting into the active phase of investigation. The journey to Cambridge was accomplished in a first-class carriage that Holmes had secured, ensuring US privacy for our discussions. The train pulled away from King's Cross with a great exhalation of steam and the metallic shriek of wheels finding their rhythm on the rails. London gave way gradually to countryside, the close-packed buildings thinning into suburbs, then scattered villages, and finally open fields still bearing the autumn's fading colours. Browns and golds and the deep green of winter wheat just beginning to show. Professor Blackwood had brought with him a leather satchel containing photostat copies of several journal pages, which he now spread across the small table that folded down between the seats. The original handwriting was remarkably clear despite its age, written in a careful medieval script that flowed across the vellum pages with the confidence of educated hands. Holmes examined them with his magnifying glass, that essential tool he carried everywhere, studying not just the words, but the very formation of the letters, the pressure of the quill, the spacing and occasional corrections. These were written by multiple individuals, he observed, his finger tracing along one particular passage. At least 4 different hands appear in these samples alone. Presumably, the society kept a communal record, each member contributing their experiences and visions. He looked up at Blackwood. The entries describing the 3 deaths, were they all in the same hand? The professor leaned forward, his finger finding the relevant passages across 3 different pages. No, and that is part of what makes it so peculiar. The first prophecy, about Thomas the Keeper of Texts, was written by someone who signs himself Brother Sylvanus. The second, about Catherine of the Painted Visions, bears the mark of Sister Moonlight. Many members adopted such mystical names. And the third, my own predicted death, was recorded by the Seeker of Sealed Wisdom. The train swayed gently as it took a curve, the rhythm of the wheels creating a hypnotic percussion beneath our conversation. Through the window, I watched a farmer guiding a plough through muddy earth, his horses leaning into their work, breath steaming in the cold air. A flock of crows lifted from a bare tree, their dark forms wheeling against the grey sky, before settling in a neighbouring field. Holmes set down his magnifying glass and steepled his fingers beneath his chin, that characteristic gesture of deep thought. So, we have 3 different prophets, if we may call them that, each foreseeing a death 6 centuries hence. The question becomes, how specific were these visions? Did they truly name Thomas Ashford and Catherine Holbrook, or have the names been, shall we say, adapted to fit modern circumstances? The names are not exact, Blackwood admitted, his voice barely audible above the train's rhythmic clatter. Brother Sylvanus wrote of Thomas qui custos sacrorum textuum est, Thomas, who is keeper of sacred texts. Sister Moonlight described Catharina Pictorum Visionum, Catherine of Painted Visions. The modern victims' names and professions match remarkably well, but there is room for interpretation, for making connections that might not be entirely. He was interrupted by a sudden sharp crack, the sound of splintering wood that caused all 3 of us to start. The window nearest Holmes had developed a long fracture, a crack running from corner to corner, though the glass had not shattered. For a moment we sat frozen, staring at the damage, before Holmes moved with swift efficiency to examine it. "A stone from the railbed, most likely," he said, though his tone carried a note of uncertainty. "Thrown up by the wheels and striking at precisely the right angle." He ran his finger along the crack, then looked out through the damaged pane at the passing countryside. Or perhaps not. The remainder of our journey passed without further incident, though I noticed Holmes maintained a vigilant watch through the cracked window, his eyes scanning the landscape with that peculiar intensity that meant his mind was cataloguing every detail, sorting and filing information against future need. Blackwood had withdrawn into himself, his hands folded in his lap, his gaze unfocused, as though he were looking at something far beyond the comfortable confines of our railway carriage. Cambridge revealed itself gradually through the morning mist. First, the spires of its ancient colleges, rising like ships' masts from a sea of fog. Then, the closer details of medieval architecture, of courts and quadrangles and gardens still holding the last roses of autumn. We disembarked at the station and secured a cab to take us to Blackwood's College, a venerable institution whose foundation stones had been laid in the 13th century, making it nearly contemporary with the Silver Moth Society itself. The college porter, an elderly man with magnificent white whiskers and the bearing of one who had seen generations of scholars pass through these gates, greeted Professor Blackwood with evident relief. "Very glad to see you safe, sir," he said, his voice carrying the soft vowels of East Anglia. "Mr. Thornhill has been asking after you since yesterday evening. Said it was most urgent he speak with you upon your return." We found David Thornhill in the research room where the Silver Moth materials were kept, a converted chapel with high vaulted ceilings and narrow windows that admitted light in dusty shafts. He was a young man of perhaps 25, with dark hair and intense eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, and he looked as though he had not slept any better than Holmes. He stood as we entered, relief and agitation warring on his features. "Professor Blackwood, thank God, I have been trying to reach you. Something has happened, something impossible." He gestured toward the long table where the medieval documents were arranged in careful rows, each in its protective case. "Last night, I was working late, cataloguing the ritual objects. I left everything precisely organized, locked the room as always. But this morning, when I returned," he crossed to the table and indicated a gap in the otherwise orderly arrangement. "One of the journals is missing, the most important one, the final journal that contains the last entries from March 1324, the one that describes the Great Transformation and contains the most detailed accounts of the Society's ultimate fate. It is simply gone." Holmes moved immediately to examine the table, his magnifying glass appearing as if by magic in his hand. He studied the empty space, the lock on the door, the windows set too high in the walls for anyone to have entered that way. The morning light slanted through those windows now, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air, giving the room an almost ethereal quality, as though we stood in a place suspended between past and a present. "Who else has keys to this room?" Holmes asked, his voice sharp with focus. "Only myself, Professor Blackwood, and the college master," Thornhill replied. "The porter has a master key, of course, but he swears no one entered after I locked up last night at 10 o'clock. Blackwood had gone pale again, his hand gripping the back of a chair for support. "The final journal," he whispered, "the one that might explain what truly happened to the Silver Moth Society, the one that might tell us how to stop what is happening now." Holmes straightened from his examination, his expression grave. "Or," he said quietly, "the one that someone very much wanted to ensure we could not read." The silence that followed Holmes's observation seemed to gather weight in the vaulted chapel, pressing down upon us like a physical presence. Dust continued its lazy dance through the shafts of morning light, indifferent to the implicati light, indifferent to the implications of what had just been discovered. I found myself studying the empty space on the table where the journal should have been, as though intense enough observation might cause it to materialize from thin air, might undo whatever careful theft had removed it from this supposedly secure sanctuary. Thornhill removed his spectacles and cleaned them with a handkerchief, his hands shaking slightly, a nervous gesture I recognized from my medical practice, the body's small rebellion against mental distress. "I do not understand how this is possible," he said, replacing the spectacles on his nose with exaggerated care. "The room was locked. The windows are too high and too narrow for anyone to enter. Yet the journal has vanished as completely as if it had never existed." Holmes had begun a methodical circuit of the room, his keen eyes examining every surface, every shadow, every potential point of entry or exit. He paused at each window, standing on a chair, to inspect the latches and the stone sills beyond. At the door, he spent several minutes examining the lock with his glass, then the hinges, then the very grain of the wood itself. I watched him work with the familiar mixture of admiration and impatience. Admiration for the thoroughness of his methods, impatience because I knew this process could not be rushed, that Holmes would examine every inch of this space before pronouncing his conclusions. Professor Blackwood had sunk into one of the wooden chairs that lined the walls, chairs that had perhaps held medieval scholars centuries ago, their wood worn smooth by generations of contemplative sitting. He stared at the table with its neat rows of protected documents, all present except for the one that mattered most, and I could see the weight of guilt settling across his shoulders. He had discovered these materials, brought them into the light, and now they had become instruments of murder and mystery, tools in some game whose rules we did not yet understand. "Tell me about yesterday," Holmes said, abandoning his examination of the door to turn his attention to Thornhill. "Every detail, no matter how insignificant it may seem. What time did you arrive? Was anything unusual about the room? Did anyone visit? Did you notice anything out of place?" The young scholar gathered his thoughts, his fingers drumming a nervous rhythm against his knee. "I arrived at 8:30, as I always do. The room was exactly as I had left it the previous evening. All the materials in their proper places, the temperature and humidity controls functioning correctly. I spent the morning cataloguing a series of ritual implements, silver chalices, ceremonial daggers, that sort of thing. Around noon, I went to take my lunch in the hall. A church bell began to toll outside, its deep voice rolling across the college grounds, marking the hour of 11. The sound entered through the high windows and seemed to hang in the chapel's acoustic space, each note lingering before giving way to the next. Holmes waited for the bells to finish before gesturing for Thornhill to continue. When I returned at 1 o'clock, Professor Marcus Whitworth was waiting outside the door. He teaches ecclesiastical history here, has done for 30 years. He had heard about the discovery and wondered if he might be permitted to view some of the materials. I saw no harm in it. Professor Blackwood had mentioned that selected colleagues might be granted access for research purposes. Holmes's eyebrows rose fractionally. And did you allow him entry? I did. He spent perhaps 45 minutes examining various documents, making notes in his little leather journal that he always carries. He was particularly interested in the ritual descriptions, the accounts of their mystical experiences. He asked several questions about the society's beliefs, their organizational structure. Then he thanked me and departed. I locked the door behind him and continued my work. Did he examine the final journal? Holmes asked. The one that is now missing? Thornhill frowned, his eyes distant with the effort of recollection. He did, yes. He spent considerable time with it, in fact, made quite extensive notes. But Mr. Holmes, Professor Whitworth, is one of the most respected scholars in his field. The idea that he would... I make no accusations, Holmes interrupted gently. I merely gather facts. What happened after Professor Whitworth departed? I worked until 6 o'clock, then locked the room and went to dine. I returned at 7:30 to complete the cataloguing of the ritual objects, worked until 10, and then locked up for the evening. The final journal was definitely present when I left. I had been consulting it myself earlier in the evening, comparing some of the ritual descriptions with the physical objects. Holmes had moved to the table and was examining the protected documents with intense focus, occasionally lifting one to study it more closely. The morning light shifted slightly as clouds moved across the sun, changing the quality of illumination in the room, making the shadows deeper and the highlighted surfaces more luminous. Outside, I could hear the sounds of the college coming to life, students calling to each other, the crunch of footsteps on gravel paths, somewhere a door slamming with hollow finality. These protective cases, Holmes said, lifting one to examine its construction. They are locked individually, are they not? Yes, Blackwood replied, rising from his chair to join Holmes at the table. Each document is sealed in an archival case with its own small lock. The keys are kept in a secure cabinet in my office. And the case that held the missing journal, is it also gone? Thornhill crossed quickly to a storage cabinet against the far wall and opened it, revealing rows of empty protective cases stacked neatly on shelves. The case is here, he said, his voice rising with surprise and confusion. But that means whoever took the journal had access to your keys, Professor Blackwood. Holmes finished. They unlocked the room, unlocked the individual case, removed the journal, returned the case to storage, and locked everything behind them. This was not a hasty theft, but a carefully planned operation, executed by someone with detailed knowledge of your security procedures. A sudden gust of wind rattled the high windows, causing one that had been slightly ajar to swing open with a prolonged creak. The sound echoed through the chapel's stone architecture, and for a moment, cold air flowed into the room, carrying with it the scent of autumn leaves and damp earth and something else, something faintly sweet and unidentifiable. Thornhill moved to close the window, standing on the same chair Holmes had used earlier, and as he did, something small and white fluttered down from the sill. It was a piece of paper, folded once, and as it fell, it caught the light in such a way that I could see it bore writing in a familiar metallic sheen. Thornhill retrieved it from the floor and carried it to Holmes with the careful handling one might give a venomous serpent. Holmes unfolded it, and even from where I stood, I could see the drawing. Another silver moth, wings spread, positioned over a heart. But this time, There were more words beneath the image, a longer message in that same archaic script. The seeker has found, the keeper has kept, the painter has seen. Now the scholar shall understand. The silver moths take flight when the moon is dark, and those who disturb the sacred transformation shall themselves be transformed. Professor Blackwood read over Holmes's shoulder, and I saw the colour drain from his face. "The new moon," he whispered. "It is tonight. According to this, I am to die tonight." Holmes folded the paper with deliberate calm and placed it in his pocket. "According to this," he corrected, "someone wants you to believe you will die tonight. There is a considerable difference, Professor, between prophecy and threat, between mystical inevitability and human malice. We shall ensure that you see tomorrow's sunrise. I promise you that. But first, we must speak with Professor Whitworth." We left the chapel-turned-archive and made our way through the college's ancient corridors, our footsteps echoing off stone floors that had been worn concave by centuries of scholarly feet. The walls were lined with portraits of past masters and benefactors, their painted eyes seeming to follow our progress with expressions ranging from benevolence to stern judgment. Somewhere in the building, a clock chimed the quarter hour, its mechanism so old that each note carried a slight irregularity, a wavering quality that made the sound seem almost alive. Professor Whitworth's rooms were located in the oldest part of the college, up a narrow spiral staircase, whose stone steps had been polished smooth and treacherous by use. Holmes climbed them with the agility of a man half his age, while I followed more carefully, one hand on the cold stone wall for balance. Blackwood and Thornhill brought up the rear, their breathing laboured from both exertion and anxiety. The door at the top of the stairs stood slightly ajar, and through the opening I could see a slice of the room beyond. Bookshelves reaching toward a timbered ceiling, a fireplace with embers still glowing from an earlier fire, papers scattered across a desk in scholarly disarray. Holmes knocked firmly, the sound seeming overloud in the confined space of the stairwell, and when no answer came, he pushed the door fully open. The room was empty, but it had been occupied recently. The embers in the fireplace still radiated warmth. A cup of tea sat half-finished on the desk, and a pen lay uncapped beside an open journal. Holmes entered with the confidence of someone who knew that the pursuit of truth sometimes required the bending of social conventions, and I followed, my medical training making me automatically scan the space for any sign of distress or struggle. There was none. The room appeared to be that of a dedicated scholar engaged in routine research. Books piled on every available surface, papers covered in dense handwriting, the accumulated detritus of a life spent in pursuit of knowledge. But as Holmes moved toward the desk, something caught his eye that made him stop abruptly. There, lying open on the blotter, was the missing journal. Its vellum pages were illuminated by the morning light from the window, and I could see the medieval script covering them, could see the dates that marked the final entries of the Silver Moth Society. March 1324, just as Blackwood had said, the last records of a group that had vanished from history. But what drew my attention, what made my breath catch in my throat, was the symbol drawn in fresh silver ink across the topmost page. Another moth, another heart, and beneath it, in that same modern hand that had threatened Blackwood, words that made the hair on the back of my neck stand erect. The scholar understands too much. The keeper's silence is required. The transformation comes for all who know the truth. Recalling Sherlock Holmes' case, details and narrative progression. Holmes stood Mosho ARRT 5. Holmes stood motionless before the desk, his shadow falling across the open journal like a dark finger pointing towards secrets we were only beginning to comprehend. The room around us seemed to hold its breath, the fire's embers pulsing their slow rhythm, the curtains hanging without movement, despite the draught that must surely be present in this ancient stone tower. Even the dust motes suspended in the morning light, appearing frozen in their eternal descent. I moved closer to examine the journal myself, careful not to disturb anything, my physician's instinct to observe without interfering, asserting itself even in these most irregular circumstances. The silver ink was still wet, I realized, noting how it caught the light with that peculiar luminescence that suggested recent application. Holmes noticed this too, extending one long finger to hover just above the surface without quite touching it, then withdrawing his hand and bringing it to his nose, inhaling deeply as though the air itself might carry information. Applied within the last 20 minutes, he murmured, more to himself than to us, perhaps less. The person who wrote this message may still be in the building. He turned sharply to Thornhill, who stood in the doorway with Blackwood, both men appearing frozen by the implications of what we had discovered. Where would Professor Whitworth most likely be at this hour? Does he keep regular habits? Thornhill's voice emerged thin and uncertain. He takes his morning constitutional in the gardens, weather permitting. He is quite particular about it. 9 o'clock precisely, a circuit of the grounds that takes him approximately 40 minutes. He should have returned by now, should be here working on his correspondence. He is always here at this hour. Without another word, Holmes was moving, his long legs carrying him past us and down the spiral stairs with such speed that I had to hurry to keep pace. We emerged from the tower into weak sunlight that had finally burned through the morning's mist, revealing the college gardens in their autumn splendor. Beds of chrysanthemums still holding color, ivy climbing the ancient walls in cascades of deep green, gravel paths winding between carefully maintained lawns where the grass glistened with departing dew. A groundskeeper was trimming a hedge near the entrance to the garden, his shears making rhythmic snipping sounds that carried clearly through the crisp air. Holmes approached him with such intensity that the poor man nearly dropped his tools, startled by the sudden appearance of this hawk-faced stranger, whose eyes seemed to see through surfaces into the essential nature of things. "Professor Whitworth," Holmes said, without preamble. "Have you seen him this morning during his walk?" The groundskeeper, a weathered man of perhaps 50, with soil permanently embedded beneath his fingernails, nodded slowly. "I, sir, saw him about 9:30, walking toward the old chapel ruins at the far end of the grounds. Thought it a bit odd, that. He usually keeps to the main paths. But scholars are peculiar folk, meaning no disrespect to present company." Holmes was already moving again, following the groundskeeper's pointing finger toward a section of the gardens I had not previously noticed, where the maintained grounds gave way to wilder growth, and the remains of a medieval chapel stood in picturesque decay. Blackwood and Thornhill followed, their academic robes flapping behind them like the wings of anxious birds, while I kept pace with Holmes, my hand instinctively checking for the reassuring weight of my revolver in my pocket. The ruins appeared gradually through a screen of overgrown yew trees, their ancient trunks twisted twisted into shapes that suggested great age and patient endurance. The chapel itself had lost its roof centuries ago, leaving only walls of weathered stone that reached toward the sky like broken fingers. Ivy had claimed much of the structure, softening the harsh lines of architectural decay. And within what had once been the nave, wildflowers had established themselves in the accumulated soil of ages. Late autumn blooms that added unexpected colour to the scene of dissolution. We found Professor Marcus Whitworth sitting on a fallen block of masonry that might once have been part of the altar, his back against the remaining wall, his eyes closed as though in meditation or prayer. He did not move as we approached, did not acknowledge our presence even when our footsteps crunched over the fallen leaves that carpeted the chapel floor. For one terrible moment, I thought we had arrived too late, that whatever force had claimed Thomas Ashford and Catherine Holbrook had already worked its will upon this third victim. But then I saw the slight rise and fall of his chest, the faint movement of his lips, as though he were speaking words too quiet for us to hear. Holmes reached him first, kneeling before the elderly scholar with uncharacteristic gentleness, one hand extended but not quite touching, waiting for permission or awareness. "Professor Whitworth," Holmes said softly, his voice carrying none of its usual sharpness. "Can you hear me? Are you injured?" The old man's eyes opened slowly, revealing irises of pale blue that seemed to look through Holmes rather than at him, focused on something invisible to the rest of us. His lips moved again, and this time I could hear the words, spoken in a voice like dry leaves rustling. "They came for me," he whispered. "The silver moths. I saw them. They filled the air like snow, their wings catching the moonlight, even though it is day. They told me. They showed me." He broke off, a shudder running through his thin frame. I moved forward, my medical training overriding my uncertainty, and placed my fingers against his wrist to check his pulse. It was rapid but steady, his skin cool but not dangerously so. His pupils were dilated, I noted, and there was a faint sheen of perspiration on his forehead, despite the morning's chill. The symptoms suggested shock, possibly combined with some form of hallucinogenic influence, though what substance might produce such effects I could not immediately determine. "He needs warmth and rest," I said, looking to Holmes. "We should move him inside, get him to his rooms or the college infirmary." But Whitworth's hand suddenly shot out, gripping Holmes's sleeve with surprising strength. "No," he said, his voice gaining force. "No, you must understand. I thought they were merely metaphor, symbolic representation of mystical transformation. But they are real, Mr. Holmes. The Silver Moth Society did not die out. They transcended. They achieved what they sought. And now they have returned to prevent anyone from discovering the truth of what they became." A sudden, sharp crack echoed through the ruins, startling all of us into frozen alertness. One of the ancient stones in the chapel wall had split, fractured by some combination of frost and age, and the relentless work of the ivy's roots. It fell with a heavy thud, sending up a small cloud of stone dust that caught the light like the very moths Whitworth had described. And for a moment, the resemblance was so striking that I felt an irrational chill run through me. Holmes helped Whitworth to his feet, supporting the elderly professor with steady strength. "We shall discuss what you have seen, what you believe you understand," he said. "But first, as Dr. Watson suggests, we must ensure you are safe and warm. Professor Blackwood, if you would be so good as to take Professor Whitworth's other arm. Together, we made our slow way back through the gardens, our strange procession, drawing curious glances from students who paused in their hurried transit between lectures. The groundskeeper watched us pass with the knowing expression of one who has seen many mysteries unfold within these ancient walls, and has learned not to ask questions. A bell began to ring, calling the faithful to midday service, and its sound followed us across the grounds like a benediction or a warning. We installed Whitworth in his rooms, building up the fire until it blazed with genuine warmth, settling him into his favourite chair with a blanket across his knees and a generous measure of brandy in his trembling hands. Colour gradually returned to his face as the warmth penetrated, and his eyes lost some of their distant, haunted quality, focusing more clearly on his surroundings and on us. Holmes had been examining the room with greater care during this process, and I saw him pause at the desk where the stolen journal still lay open. He picked up the pen that rested beside it, examining the nib with his glass, then opened the small bottle of ink that stood nearby. His expression shifted, and he beckoned me over with a subtle gesture. The ink bottle contained, as I could now see clearly in the stronger light, not ordinary writing fluid, but a suspension of metallic particles in a thick base, the same silver ink that had been used for all the threatening messages. And beside it, partially hidden beneath a stack of papers, was a small paintbrush with silver residue on its bristles. "Professor Whitworth," Holmes said, his tone carefully neutral, "perhaps you should tell us everything, beginning with why you found it necessary to paint silver moths on the foreheads and palms of dead colleagues." The old scholar's face crumpled, and tears began to track down his weathered cheeks. "I never meant for anyone to die," he said, his voice breaking. "You must believe me. I only wanted to understand, to recreate the conditions described in the journals, to see if the visions they reported could be induced through the same methods. I prepared the silver ink according to their formula. I meditated in the manner they described. I painted the symbol on myself as they had done, and I saw, God help me, I saw the moths. They were beautiful and terrible, and they whispered secrets that human minds were not meant to comprehend." He took a shaking sip of his brandy, gathering himself with visible effort. "Thomas Ashford came to me, you see, after he learned of the discovery. He had spent his life studying these mystical movements, and he wanted to experience what they had experienced. I prepared the ink for him, painted the symbol as the journals described. He was old, his heart was weak. I never imagined that the shock of the visions would." His voice failed completely, and he sat trembling, wrapped in guilt and confusion, and something that might have been genuine terror. Outside, clouds had covered the sun again, and the room dimmed, the firelight becoming the primary source of illumination, casting shadows that seemed to move with their own intention across the walls and ceiling. 10 she straighted narrative continuation, with atmospheric pacing and plot advancement. Whitworth's confession hung in the air like smoke from the fireplace, curling and dispersing into the shadows that gathered in the corners of his cluttered study. Holmes had seated himself on the edge of the desk, one leg swinging slightly in that manner that indicated his mind was working through multiple threads of thought simultaneously, weaving them into patterns that would eventually reveal the complete tapestry of truth. I remained standing near the door, positioned where I could observe both the professor in his chair and the window that looked out over the college grounds, my hand never straying far from the pocket where my revolver rested. The fire settled with a soft collapse of embers, sending sparks floating upward into the chimney's darkness. Somewhere in the building, footsteps passed, quick, purposeful, the sound of a student late for a tutorial, and then faded into the general hum of collegiate life that formed a constant backdrop to our conversation. Blackwood had moved to the window, his back to us, his shoulders rigid with the tension of a man hearing his worst fears confirmed. Thornhill stood beside the bookshelf, one hand resting on a volume of medieval texts as though seeking stability in the familiar weight of scholarship. "Continue," Holmes said gently, and there was something in his tone that surprised me. Not accusation, but a kind of understanding, as though he recognized in Whitworth's actions the dangerous intersection of intellectual curiosity and human frailty. "Tell us about Catherine Holbrook." The old professor's hands tightened around his brandy glass, the firelight catching in the amber liquid and setting it glowing like captured sunlight. "Catherine was different," he said, his voice steadier now, finding strength in the act of confession itself. "She approached me, you see. She had heard rumours of my experiments, of what I had discovered in replicating the Society's methods. She was fascinated by their use of visual symbolism, the way they claimed to capture divine visions in painted form. She wanted to see if the silver ink, applied as the journals described, would grant her the same revelatory experiences they had recorded." He paused to sip his brandy, and I noticed how his hands no longer trembled quite so violently, as though the unburdening of his secrets was providing a kind of therapeutic relief. "I warned her," he continued. "I told her what had happened to Thomas, though I framed it as coincidence, as the unfortunate failure of an already weak heart. But she was insistent. She had spent her life studying mystical art, seeking to understand the consciousness behind such works. This was, to her mind, a unique opportunity to experience that consciousness directly. The clouds outside shifted, allowing a brief shaft of sunlight to penetrate the room, illuminating the dust that danced in the air above Whitworth's chair. The light caught the tears still wet on his cheeks, making them shine like trails of silver ink themselves. And for a moment, he looked ancient beyond his years, a man who had glimpsed something that had aged his soul, even as it fascinated his mind. "The ritual requires preparation," Whitworth said, his eyes distant with memory. "Meditation, fasting, the recitation of certain phrases in medieval Latin, the application of the silver ink at the precise moment when consciousness is most receptive. I performed the ceremony for Catherine in her study at the British Museum, late at night when the building was empty. She sat in her chair, her hand extended, as Sister Moonlight had described in the journal, palm upward, receptive to the moth's blessing." Holmes leaned forward slightly, his grey eyes intent. "And what happened?" "I painted the moth upon her palm with the finest brush, following the intricate pattern recorded in the manuscripts. The silver gleamed in the lamplight. Catherine's breathing slowed, her eyes became unfocused, and then she smiled. Such a beautiful smile, Mr. Holmes, full of wonder and joy. She whispered that she could see them, hundreds of silver moths filling the air around her, their wings creating patterns of exquisite complexity. She said she understood, finally understood, what the medieval mystics had been trying to capture in their illuminated manuscripts. A log in the fireplace split with a sharp crack, and we all started slightly at the sound. Whitworth seemed to return from wherever his memories had taken him, focusing again on the present moment, on the small circle of listeners who had become the recipients of his terrible truth. "She died," he said simply. Her heart simply stopped, just as Thomas Ashford's had done. One moment she was smiling, reaching toward visions only she could see, and the next. His voice broke again, and he covered his face with one hand. "I should have stopped then. I should have destroyed the ink, burned the journals, put an end to the madness. But I could not. The visions, Mr. Holmes, once you have seen them, they haunt you. They call to you. The silver moths promise transformation, transcendence, escape from the prison of ordinary consciousness." Blackwood turned from the window, his face pale but composed. "And so you painted the moth upon yourself," he said. "This morning, in the ruins, you were attempting to induce the visions again." Whitworth nodded slowly. "I thought if I could understand the mechanism, if I could experience the transformation they described without dying in the process, I might discover what truly happened to the society, where they went, what they became. The final journal, the one I took from your archive, it describes the great transformation in detail, speaks of a threshold that can be crossed, a place beyond mortality, where consciousness continues in a form of pure silver light." Holmes rose from the desk and moved to the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back in that characteristic pose of deep contemplation. The fire's warmth must have been intense where he stood, but he seemed not to notice, his mind clearly occupied with assembling the pieces of this peculiar puzzle into their proper configuration. "Let me see if I understand correctly," he said, his voice measured and thoughtful. "You recreated a medieval ritual designed to induce mystical visions. This ritual involves the application of an ink containing suspended silver particles, painted in a specific pattern upon the body, while the subject is in a meditative state. 2 people have died during or shortly after this ritual, both of them elderly individuals with pre-existing heart conditions. You believe the visions themselves somehow caused their deaths, that the shock of whatever they experienced was sufficient to stop their hearts. I do not merely believe it, Mr. Holmes. I know it. I have experienced the visions myself 3 times now, and each time I have felt my heart falter, felt myself standing on the edge of that threshold the journals describe. It is only by force of will that I have pulled myself back, that I have chosen to remain in this world, rather than following the silver moths to whatever realm they inhabit." A sudden gust of wind rattled the window in its frame, and with it came the sound of voices from the quad below, students arguing about some point of philosophy or theology, their young voices full of certainty and intellectual passion. The sound seemed to belong to a different world, a safer and more comprehensible reality than the one we were currently navigating through our conversation with this tortured scholar. Thornhill spoke for the first time since we had returned to Whitworth's rooms, his voice hesitant but determined. The threatening messages, though, the prophecies from the medieval journals that seemed to predict these deaths. Professor Blackwood received explicit threats. How do those fit with what you are describing? Whitworth's expression shifted, confusion replacing the distant haunted quality that had dominated his features. Threatening messages. I know nothing of any threats. I painted the moths on Thomas and Catherine as part of the ritual. Yes, but only after their deaths, as the journals prescribed. The symbol is meant to mark those who have crossed the threshold, who have achieved the transformation. I never sent Professor Blackwood any messages. I did not even know he had discovered the Society's archives until young Thornhill mentioned it yesterday. Holmes turned sharply, his eyes suddenly blazing with renewed intensity. You painted the moths after their deaths, not before? Yes, of course. The ritual requires. Whitworth stopped abruptly, his face going even paler as understanding began to dawn. Someone else. There is someone else who knows about the ritual, who has been... He could not finish the thought, the implications too overwhelming. The room fell silent, save for the fire's steady consumption of wood, and the wind's whisper against the windows. Holmes stood motionless, his mind clearly racing through the new configuration of facts this revelation had created. I felt my own understanding shifting, pieces of the puzzle rearranging themselves into a pattern that was simultaneously more and less disturbing than what I had previously imagined. It was Blackwood who broke the silence, his voice tight with controlled fear. If Professor Whitworth did not send the threatening messages, if he knows nothing of the prophecies being enacted, then who has been watching us? Who painted the fresh moth in this very room less than an hour ago? Who is orchestrating these deaths to look like the fulfillment of medieval visions? As if in answer to his questions, there came a soft knock at the door, 3 measured taps that seemed to echo with significance in the charged atmosphere of the room. We all turned toward the sound, and I saw Holmes's hand move subtly toward his own pocket, where I knew he kept a small but effective pistol. The knocking came again, patient and inexorable, and when no one moved to answer, the door began to open slowly, revealing a figure silhouetted against the light from the corridor beyond. The figure that stepped through the doorway was not the menacing presence our imaginations had conjured in that moment of suspended breath, but rather a slender woman of perhaps 40 years, dressed in the practical dark skirts and white blouse of a college administrator. She carried a leather portfolio under one arm and wore an expression of professional concern that suggested she had interrupted something she did not quite understand, but felt obligated to address. Her hair, iron grey, despite her relative youth, was pulled back in a severe bun, and her eyes, pale hazel behind wire-rimmed spectacles, moved quickly from face to face, assessing our small gathering with evident puzzlement. "Professor Whitworth," she said, her voice carrying the precise diction of someone who had trained herself to be heard in echoing stone corridors. "I do apologize for the intrusion, but the master has been asking after you. You missed the faculty meeting this morning, and there was some concern when you could not be found in any of your usual locations." Her gaze settled on Holmes with particular curiosity. "I was not aware you were receiving visitors." The tension that had coiled through the room like a living thing dissipated somewhat, though Holmes's expression remained watchful, his posture alert. Whitworth seemed to deflate in his chair, the adrenaline of our confrontation giving way to ordinary exhaustion. He made a vague gesture that might have been introduction or dismissal. "Mrs. Dalton, these gentlemen they are colleagues, consulting on a matter of historical research. Please convey my apologies to the master. I am afraid I am not feeling entirely well. I shall attend upon him this afternoon if my health permits." Mrs. Dalton's expression softened with what appeared to be genuine concern. "Shall I send for the college physician, Professor? You do look rather pale, if you will forgive my saying so." Before Whitworth could respond, Holmes intervened with the smooth courtesy he could deploy when it suited his purposes. "That will not be necessary, Mrs. Dalton. I am Sherlock Holmes, and this is Dr. John Watson. The Professor has had a trying morning, but Dr. Watson has already attended to him. Some rest and quiet should see him recovered by evening." Recognition flickered across her features. "The detective from London. I have read of your cases in the newspapers. How extraordinary that you should be here at Cambridge." She paused, and I saw calculation behind her professional demeanour. This matter of historical research, it would not have anything to do with the discovery Professor Blackwood made, would it? The medieval archives that have caused such excitement in certain academic circles. Holmes tilted his head slightly, acknowledging the question without directly answering it. "You are well informed about the college's scholarly activities, Mrs. Dalton." "It is my position to be so, Mr. Holmes. I am the senior bursar's administrative assistant. Very little occurs within these walls that does not eventually cross my desk in one form or another." She adjusted her grip on the portfolio, and I noticed that her hands were ink-stained, the fingers of a woman who spent her days with ledgers and correspondence. "The discovery has generated considerable paperwork, insurance considerations for such valuable historical materials, security arrangements, requests from various scholars seeking access. I have been managing those requests for Professor Blackwood." Thornhill straightened from his position by the bookshelf, sudden interest lighting his features. "You have records of everyone who has inquired about the archives?" Holmes crossed the room with 3 swift strides and took the folder before Thornhill could reach it, his eyes scanning the contents with that remarkable speed that allowed him to absorb information at a rate that seemed almost supernatural. I watched his expression shift subtly, not surprise exactly, but something adjacent to it. The look of a man finding confirmation of a suspicion he had only half formed. "Mrs. Dalton," he said, looking up from the papers, "among these requests for access to the Silver Moth archives, is there one from a scholar or institution that struck you as unusual? Perhaps someone whose credentials did not quite align with their stated research interests, or whose urgency seemed disproportionate to the academic nature of the inquiry." She considered the question with the careful attention of someone who took pride in her professional judgment. The afternoon light from the window caught her spectacles, making her eyes momentarily invisible behind reflected brightness before she shifted position, and they became visible again, thoughtful and shrewd. "There was one inquiry that seemed somewhat odd," she said slowly. "It came from a private collector in London, a Mr. Sebastian Northcote. He claimed to be writing a book on medieval mystical movements and requested permission to photograph certain documents for inclusion. His letter was professionally written, certainly, but there was something in the tone that suggested a personal investment beyond mere scholarly interest. The way he described the society, it was as though he were writing about living associates rather than people dead for 6 centuries. Blackwood had turned from the window, his attention now fully engaged. "Northcote," he repeated. "I know that name. He has published several articles in obscure journals about secret societies and mystical traditions. Thoroughly researched, but with an undercurrent of, I hesitate to say belief, but perhaps sympathy for the subjects that goes beyond academic objectivity. I denied his request for access. The materials were too newly discovered, too fragile to be handled by anyone outside the immediate research team. 3 weeks ago, I sent him a letter explaining that the archives were not yet available for general scholarly access, but that I would be happy to consider his application once we had completed the initial cataloguing and assessment. Holmes returned to the folder, extracting a particular sheet and holding it up to the light. And did Mr. Northcote accept this denial with good grace? I received no response, Blackwood admitted. I assumed he had moved on to other research interests. The fire crackled loudly, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney, and a log rolled forward in the grate. I moved to push it back with the poker, the metal warm in my hand, the heat of the flames intense against my face. Outside, bells began to ring across the college, marking the hour of 1 o'clock, their tones varying in pitch and timbre as different towers contributed their voices to the daily symphony of time's passage. Mrs. Dalton had been watching this exchange with growing concern, her professional composure beginning to crack slightly. Gentlemen, am I to understand that this Mr. Northcote might be connected to something more serious than academic research? Should the college authorities be informed? Holmes folded the papers and returned them to the folder, which he handed back to her with a slight bow. I think it would be prudent to inform the master that there may be a security concern regarding the Silver Moth archives. However, I would ask that you do so with discretion. We do not wish to cause alarm or to alert certain parties that we are aware of their interest. She nodded, professional competence reasserting itself. I understand. I shall speak with the master privately and ensure that the archives are given additional security monitoring. She glanced at Whitworth, who had been silent throughout this exchange, his gaze fixed on the fire. Professor, are you quite certain you do not require the physician? I am certain, Mrs. Dalton. Thank you for your concern. After she had departed, her footsteps receding down the corridor with brisk efficiency, Holmes turned to address our small group. We now have a name, which is progress, but we also have a new complication. If this Sebastian Northcote is indeed our orchestrator, he has gone to extraordinary lengths to create the appearance of fulfilled prophecy. The question is why? What does he gain from making these deaths appear to be the result of medieval mysticism rather than modern murder? Thornhill had retrieved the stolen journal from Whitworth's desk and was leafing through it carefully, his scholar's training evident in how he handled the ancient pages. The final entries, he said, looking up at Holmes. They describe the transformation in greater detail than anything else in the archives. The Society believed they had discovered a method of preserving consciousness beyond death, of achieving a form of immortality through what they called the silver transcendence. They speak of preparing vessels, of creating conditions where the soul could be transferred from flesh to... He paused, frowning at the medieval script. It is unclear what exactly they meant. The metaphors become increasingly obscure. Holmes had begun pacing again, his hands clasped behind his back, his long shadow moving across the floor like a dark companion to his thoughts. Vessels, he repeated softly. Consciousness preserved. Transfer of soul from one state to another. These are alchemical concepts, are they not? The transmutation of base matter into gold, the philosopher's stone, the elixir of life, all metaphors for spiritual transformation that some took literally. Whitworth spoke from his chair, his voice regaining some of its former academic authority. The Silver Moth Society was deeply influenced by both Christian mysticism and alchemical philosophy. They believed silver to be the metal of the moon, of feminine receptivity, of the soul's mirror. Gold was the sun, the masculine, the spirit. Their great work was to unite these principles within the individual practitioner, creating what they called the argentum vivum, the living silver, consciousness made eternal. A sudden draught moved through the room, though I could not identify its source. The curtains stirred, the papers on Whitworth's desk ruffled, and with it came that same faintly sweet scent I had noticed earlier in the chapel archives, something floral, but with an underlying metallic note that prickled at the edges of recognition without quite revealing itself. Blackwood moved abruptly to the window and threw it open wide, leaning out to scan the quad below. "There," he said urgently, "by the gate, a man in a dark coat, watching this building. He has been standing there for several minutes." We crowded to the window, and I saw what Blackwood had noticed, a figure half hidden in the shadow of the gatehouse, perfectly positioned to observe Whitworth's tower, without being conspicuous to casual observers. Even at this distance, there was something intentional about his stillness, something watchful, that set my military instincts jangling with warning. Holmes studied the figure intently. Then, suddenly, his hand shot out and gripped my arm. "Watson, your revolver. Quickly." I barely had time to withdraw the revolver from my pocket before Holmes was moving again, this time toward the door with such decisive speed that we had no choice but to follow. His F that we had no choice but to follow. His footsteps echoed down the spiral staircase, the ancient stones amplifying each descent into a percussion that seemed to announce our pursuit to anyone with ears to hear. Behind me, I was aware of Blackwood and Thornhill, scrambling to keep pace, while Whitworth remained in his rooms above. Whether from exhaustion or strategic withdrawal, I could not say. The college quad spread before us as we emerged from the tower, an expanse of manicured lawn bordered by paths of pale gravel that crunched beneath our hurried steps. Students scattered at our approach, their conversations dying mid-sentence as they registered the unusual sight of their professors in flight, accompanied by strangers who moved with unmistakable purpose. The figure by the gatehouse had not moved, still maintained that unnaturally patient stillness, and as we drew closer, I began to discern more details. The cut of his coat, expensive and well-tailored. The walking stick he held not as support, but as an affectation. The way his head was tilted slightly, as though listening to music only he could hear. We were perhaps 20 yards distant when he finally stirred, turning to face us with deliberate slowness that suggested he had been aware of our approach from the moment we left Whitworth's tower. The face that regarded us was striking in its sharp, aristocratic planes. High cheekbones, a narrow nose, eyes of such pale grey they seemed almost colourless in the afternoon light. His age was difficult to determine, somewhere between 40 and 60, with silver threading through dark hair that was swept back from a high forehead. He smiled as we approached, and there was something in that expression that made my hand tighten on the revolver concealed in my pocket. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," he said, his voice carrying the cultured accent of old money and older families, each syllable precisely articulated. "I had wondered when you would arrive. The moment Professor Blackwood fled to Baker Street, I knew it was only a matter of time before the great detective involved himself in matters that are, perhaps, beyond even his considerable powers of deduction." Holmes stopped a few paces distant, his breathing barely elevated despite our rapid descent and pursuit. "Sebastian Northcote, I presume." your reputation for obsessive interest in medieval mysticism precedes you, though I confess I had not expected to find you loitering outside college buildings like a common footpad. Northcote's smile widened, revealing teeth that were remarkably white and even. Loitering suggests aimlessness, Mr. Holmes. I assure you, everything I do is executed with the most careful intention. I have been waiting here because I knew the events I set in motion would eventually draw you to this precise location at this precise time. The silver moths do not lie. Their prophecies unfold with mathematical precision. A pair of students passed nearby, casting curious glances at our small confrontation, and Northcote waited until they were out of earshot before continuing. Perhaps we should adjourn to somewhere more private. I have much to tell you, and I suspect you have questions that deserve fuller answers than can be provided in a public thoroughfare. Holmes's expression remained neutral, but I could see the calculations moving behind his eyes, weighing risks and potential gains. You claim responsibility for the deaths of Thomas Ashford and Catherine Holbrook. Claim responsibility, Northcote repeated, seeming genuinely puzzled by the phrasing. No, Mr. Holmes. I merely facilitated their transformation, helped them achieve what the Silver Moth Society achieved 6 centuries ago. They did not die, they transcended. Their consciousness continues, preserved in a state the medieval mystics could only describe through inadequate metaphor, but which modern science and ancient wisdom combined can actually accomplish. The wind picked up suddenly, sending fallen leaves skittering across the quad in spiraling patterns that momentarily resembled the flight of insects. Clouds scudded overhead, their shadows racing across the ground, and somewhere in the distance I heard the melancholy call of a crow. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees, and I found myself suppressing a shiver that had nothing to do with the physical cold. Blackwood stepped forward, his face pale, but his voice steady with controlled anger. You murdered 2 people based on the ravings of medieval mystics. You terrorized me with threats designed to make me believe I would be next. What possible justification could you offer for such monstrous actions? Northcote's gaze shifted to the professor, and something like pity crossed his refined features. Professor Blackwood, you discovered the Society's archives and immediately began treating them as mere historical curiosities, artifacts to be catalogued and analysed and stripped of their power. You never considered that they might be instructions, a manual for achieving something that humanity has sought since the first human mind contemplated its own inevitable extinction. The Society did not vanish. They succeeded. They found the method of transferring consciousness from mortal flesh into a medium that does not decay, does not age, does not die. Holmes had been studying Northcote with that peculiar intensity that meant every word, every gesture was being filed away for later analysis. Silver, he said quietly. You believe consciousness can be preserved in silver. The living silver, argentum vivum. Not belief, Mr. Holmes. Knowledge. I have spent 20 years researching the Society, tracking down every reference, every rumour, every fragment of their scattered wisdom. When Professor Blackwood announced his discovery of the complete archives, I knew the time had come to test the theories I had developed. Thomas Ashford and Catherine Holbrook were not random victims. They were willing participants in an experiment that would prove the Society's methods were sound. A sharp crack echoed across the quad, and we all turned to see that one of the ancient windows in the tower behind us had developed a long fracture, the glass spiderwebbing from some internal stress or temperature change. The sound seemed to hang in the air, a punctuation mark in our strange conversation. And when I looked back at Northcote, I saw him smiling again. Even the physical world responds to the proximity of transformation, he said softly. The barriers between states of being grow thin when the ritual approaches completion. You have felt it, surely. The sense that reality itself is becoming more fluid, more responsive to will and intention. What I have felt, Holmes said with cold precision, is the presence of a disturbed mind using pseudo-mystical justification for acts of murder. You may believe your own delusions, Mr. Northcote, but that does not make them true. Silver particles suspended in ink may create interesting visions when combined with suggestion and meditation, but they do not preserve consciousness. They do not create immortality. They simply poison the body and disturb the mind. Northcote's expression hardened, the veneer of cultured civility cracking to reveal something darker beneath. You speak from ignorance, detective. You have not seen what I have seen, have not experienced the touch of the silver moths. They showed me the truth, that consciousness is electromagnetic in nature, that it can be encoded into crystalline structures, that silver's unique properties make it the perfect medium for such preservation. The society understood this 600 years ago through mystical insight. I have confirmed it through modern science. He reached into his coat, and my hand tightened on my revolver. But what he withdrew was not a weapon, but a small silver case, ornately engraved with patterns that resembled moths in flight. He opened it to reveal what appeared to be a dozen silver coins, each one stamped with the same moth and heart symbol we had seen in the threatening messages. "These contain them," he said, his voice dropping to something almost reverent. Thomas Ashford, Catherine Holbrook, and 6 others who volunteered for the transformation over the past 2 years. Their final thoughts, their essential selves, encoded into the silver at the moment of transcendence. I can hear them sometimes, whispering at the edge of perception, confirming that the process works, that they continue beyond the dissolution of flesh. Thornhill had gone white, swaying slightly as though he might faint. "You are describing murder," he whispered. 8 people dead because of your insane beliefs. 8 people freed from the prison of mortality, Northcote corrected. And soon to be 9. Professor Blackwood, the prophecy designated you as the 3rd in this particular sequence. But you need not fear. I offer you a choice that the others did not have. You may flee, may allow the moment to pass, and live out your remaining years in ordinary fashion. Or you may embrace the transformation, may become part of something greater than yourself, may achieve the immortality you have spent your academic career studying from a safe distance. The bells began to ring again, marking the half-hour with their varied voices, and as they did, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Around the edges of the quad, standing in doorways and beneath trees and at the corners of buildings, were figures in dark clothing, at least a dozen of them, all watching our small group with the same patient stillness that Northcote had displayed. They had appeared so gradually, so unobtrusively, that I could not say when they had first taken up their positions. Holmes had noticed them too, his eyes scanning the quad with quick efficiency, calculating odds and escape routes. "You brought associates," he observed. "Members of your reconstituted Silver Moth Society, I presume." "Believers," Northcote replied. "People who understand that the old ways hold wisdom that modern materialism has forgotten. They will ensure that tonight's ritual proceeds without interference. The new moon rises at sunset, Professor Blackwood. The conditions will be perfect for your transformation. You have until then to decide whether you will embrace your destiny or flee from it. He snapped the silver case closed and returned it to his pocket, then turned to walk away, his walking stick tapping a measured rhythm against the gravel path. The figures around the quad remained in place, watching, and I realized with sinking certainty that we were surrounded by people who believed in Northcote's delusions strongly enough to act as guards for his murderous rituals. "He is mad," Blackwood said, his voice shaking. "Utterly, completely mad. And yet he commands followers, has resources, has planned this with such care. Madness and intelligence are not mutually exclusive," Holmes said grimly. "Nor are delusion and charisma. We are dealing with a man who has constructed an entire philosophical framework to justify murder, who has attracted others to his cause through the seductive promise of transcending death. The question now is how to prevent tonight's ritual from claiming another victim." The sun had moved behind thicker clouds, and the temperature continued to drop as afternoon shifted toward evening. Somewhere in the college, a door slammed with hollow finality, and the wind carried with it the first hint of the night's approaching chill. We retreated to Blackwood's private study within the college, a space smaller and more intimate, than Whitworth's cluttered tower rooms, with windows that overlooked the inner courtyard, rather than the exposed quad, where Northcote's watchers still maintained their silent vigil. The room held the accumulated comforts of years. Leather-bound books, organized by subject and period. A globe whose continents bore the names of empires long since dissolved. Photographs in silver frames showing academic gatherings and archaeological expeditions. A Persian rug whose colors had softened with age into harmonious earth tones that absorbed footfalls and created an atmosphere of sheltered quiet. Thornhill secured the door behind us, his hands fumbling slightly with the bolt before it finally slid home with a metallic click that seemed to echo with finality. Through the window, I could see shadows lengthening across the courtyard as the afternoon advanced toward evening, the light taking on that particular golden quality that comes before sunset, beautiful and melancholy in equal measure. A gardener was raking leaves in the far corner, his movements methodical and soothing, entirely oblivious to the drama unfolding within the ancient walls that surrounded him. Holmes had claimed the chair behind Blackwood's desk, not from any desire for authority, but because it afforded the best view of both the door and the windows, while keeping his back to the solid reassurance of bookshelves. He sat motionless for a long moment, his fingers steepled beneath his chin in that attitude of deep concentration I had witnessed countless times, while the rest of us found our own positions in the room. Blackwood pacing near the fireplace, Thornhill hovering near the door like a nervous sentry, myself standing where I could observe the courtyard and any approach to this sanctuary we had claimed. The mantel clock ticked its steady rhythm, each small sound a reminder of time's relentless progress toward the moment Northcote had designated for his ritual. I found my mind calculating the hours remaining, perhaps 4 until sunset, perhaps 5, depending on how one defined the boundaries between day and night. Not enough time to summon help from London, to bring in police reinforcements who might take seriously this strange tale of medieval mysticism turned deadly. And yet, perhaps enough time for Holmes to devise one of those brilliant strategies that had seen us through so many previous dangers. "He is watching the college entrances," Holmes said at last, his voice cutting through the contemplative silence. "Those followers of his, positioned around the quad, they are not merely symbolic presence. They are ensuring that Professor Blackwood cannot simply flee, cannot take the easy path of temporary escape. Northcote has created a cage whose bars are human belief, and he waits with terrible patience for nightfall to complete his work." Blackwood paused in his pacing, one hand gripping the mantel for support. "Then what do you suggest? Am I to remain trapped here until this madman's appointed hour, waiting like a condemned man for execution? There must be something we can do, some way to contact the authorities, to have Northcote arrested before—" "On what charge?" Holmes interrupted, not unkindly, but with the cold logic that characterized his approach to seemingly impossible situations. "He has made no explicit threat in the presence of witnesses who would be believed. His followers would swear he merely engaged us in philosophical discussion about medieval mysticism. The police would likely dismiss our concerns as academic disputes taken too seriously, especially given that both previous deaths were ruled as natural heart failure by examining physicians." A log settled in the fireplace with a soft collapse of ash and ember, sending a brief wash of warmth through the room. Outside, the gardener had finished his raking and was gathering his tools, preparing to retreat indoors as the day's light failed. I watched him go with something approaching envy. Here was a man whose greatest concern was the orderly management of fallen leaves, who would return to his cottage and his supper without any knowledge of silver moths or transcendent consciousness, or the thin line between mysticism and murder. Thornhill had moved to the window and was peering cautiously around the edge of the curtain, his face pressed close to the glass. "There are more of them now," he reported, his voice tight with barely controlled fear. "I count at least 20 scattered around the college grounds. Some are dressed as students, others as visitors. If I did not know to look for them, I would think them ordinary people going about ordinary business." Holmes rose from the desk and joined Thornhill at the window, his keen eyes assessing the situation with the practiced efficiency of a general surveying a battlefield. "They are ordinary people," he said quietly. "That is what makes Northcote's achievement so disturbing. These are not criminals or fanatics in any conventional sense. They are educated individuals who have been persuaded that an insane proposition represents profound truth. The human capacity for belief, properly manipulated, can transform rational minds into instruments of almost any purpose." He turned back to face Blackwood, and I saw something shift in his expression, not quite a smile, but a hardening of resolve that I recognized from those moments when he had decided upon a course of action. "Professor, I need you to tell me everything you remember about the final journal entries, the ones that describe the Society's ultimate transformation. You have read them, I assume, before Northcote stole the volume from your archives." Blackwood nodded slowly, moving to join us near the window, his academic mind engaging despite his fear. I had only begun my analysis, but yes, I read through the entire manuscript. The final entries are written in a state of heightened emotion. The script becomes more elaborate, almost artistic in its execution, as though the very act of writing had taken on ritual significance. They describe preparations for what they called the Night of Silver Ascending, a ceremony to be conducted during the new moon when darkness was most complete. The shadows in the courtyard had deepened further, and I noticed that someone had begun lighting the gas lamps along the paths, their warm glow creating pools of illumination against the gathering dusk. The quality of light in the room changed subtly as the balance shifted from natural to artificial, the fire's glow becoming more prominent, shadows in the corners growing more substantial. The ritual required specific preparations, Blackwood continued, his voice taking on the measured cadence of a lecturer, finding comfort in the familiar territory of scholarly recitation. Fasting for 3 days prior, meditation focusing on the dissolution of the boundary between self and cosmos, the creation of the silver ink according to an alchemical formula that combined silver filings with mercury, white lead, and the extract of a plant they called moon blossom, probably some variety of night-blooming flower with mildly psychoactive properties. Holmes had begun pacing, his hands clasped behind his back, absorbing every detail. And the ceremony itself, what did the final entries describe? The participants gathered in a sealed chamber, arranged in a circle with a silver bowl at the center, containing the prepared ink. Each member painted the moth symbol upon their own forehead, while reciting a chant designed to, as they described it, loosen the soul from its fleshly moorings. The final entry speaks of a great light, silver and pure, that filled the chamber, and then the journal ends mid-sentence, the quill having apparently fallen from the writer's hand. A sudden sharp sound made us all start. The window had rattled violently in its frame, though whether from wind or some other cause I could not determine. The noise seemed disproportionately loud in the quiet room, and for a moment we stood frozen, listening for any follow-up, any indication that something beyond natural forces had caused the disturbance. But the room settled back into its previous atmosphere, the fire crackling softly, the clock maintaining its steady count of passing minutes. Thornhill had gone to examine the window, running his fingers along the frame where it met the sill. "The wood is old," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "These medieval buildings shift constantly, settling into new configurations as the seasons change. It means nothing." "Perhaps," Holmes said, though his tone suggested he was not entirely convinced. "Professor Blackwood, this sealed chamber where the final ritual occurred, do you know its location? Was there any description in the journals that might allow us to identify the specific site?" Blackwood's eyes widened slightly with sudden realization. There was a reference in one of the earlier journals to a chamber beneath the chapel of St. Sylvanus, a small church that stood on land now owned by the college. The building itself was demolished in the 17th century, but the foundations remain, incorporated into the cellars beneath the library building. I had planned to investigate, once the initial cataloguing was complete, to see if any physical evidence of the Society's activities might still exist. Holmes's expression sharpened into something approaching triumph. "Then, that is where Northcote will attempt to conduct tonight's ritual, in the same chamber where the original transformation supposedly occurred. He is a man who believes in the power of sacred space, of recreating historical conditions with exacting precision. He will not settle for any random location when the authentic site is available." "But the library cellars are locked," Thornhill protested. "Access is restricted to senior staff. How could Northcote possibly—" He was interrupted by a soft knock at the door, 3 measured taps that froze all conversation. We exchanged glances, and I saw my own tension reflected in the faces around me. Holmes moved silently to position himself beside the door, while I withdrew my revolver, keeping it low but ready. The knocking came again, patient and persistent, and then a familiar voice filtered through the heavy wood. "Professor Blackwood, it is Mrs. Dalton. I have information that Mr. Holmes requested regarding the security arrangements for the archives." Holmes nodded to Thornhill, who carefully unbolted the door and opened it just wide enough to admit the college administrator. She entered quickly, her usual professional composure showing signs of strain, her iron-grey hair slightly disarranged, as though she had been moving with uncharacteristic haste. She carried another folder, and her ink-stained fingers trembled slightly as she extended it toward Holmes. "I have been reviewing the access logs, as you suggested, Mr. Holmes, and I have discovered something quite disturbing. Over the past month, there have been numerous entries to the library cellars recorded during hours when the library itself was officially closed. The entries are logged to the master key, which should only be used by the head librarian or the college master himself." Holmes opened the folder and scanned its contents with rapid attention. But the actual identity of who used the key, that is not recorded. It is not. The system relies on trust and the assumption that senior staff would not abuse their privileges. But Mr. Holmes, there is more. This evening, just 20 minutes ago, I saw the head librarian leaving the college grounds. He departed quite deliberately, carrying an overnight bag, and when I inquired about his plans, he seemed uncomfortable, evasive. He said only that urgent family business required his immediate attention in London. The implications settled over us like a cold fog. Northcote had not merely surrounded the college with followers. He had compromised its security from within, had arranged for the one person who might have prevented access to the cellars to be conveniently absent during the crucial hours. The scope of his planning, the patience of his preparation, spoke to an intelligence made more dangerous by its dedication to an insane purpose. "We have perhaps 3 hours, Holmes said, checking his pocket watch against the mantel clock. "Enough time to prepare if we move with efficiency and purpose. Watson, I shall need your medical expertise and your steady hand with that revolver. Professor Blackwood, you must remain visible in the college, must allow Northcote's watchers to see you going about ordinary activities. Let them believe you are unaware of their surveillance, that you pose no threat to their plans." "But surely I should be as far from here as possible," Blackwood protested. "If they are planning to—" "They are planning nothing," Holmes interrupted with calm certainty. "We are planning everything. By the time the moon rises tonight, we shall be waiting in that cellar chamber, ready to transform Northcote's ritual into something quite different from what he anticipates. The silver moths, Professor, are about to discover that even the most carefully constructed delusion cannot withstand the cold light of reason, backed by preparation and resolve. Concluding mystery while orchestrating resolution and closure. Darkness had claimed the college grounds completely by the time we descended into the library's lower regions, moving through corridors that grew progressively older as we penetrated deeper into the building's historical foundations. The gas lamps that illuminated the upper floors gave way to electric bulbs in the intermediate levels, and finally, as we reached the oldest sections, to the wavering light of candles that Holmes had procured from from the chapel sacristy. The flamelight created a moving landscape of shadows that seemed to breathe against the ancient stone walls, and our footsteps echoed in ways that suggested vast spaces beyond the reach of illumination. The air grew colder as we descended, carrying with it the scent of earth and old mortar and something else, that same faintly sweet metallic fragrance I had noticed earlier, now stronger, more pervasive, as though the very stones had absorbed it over centuries and were releasing it back into the atmosphere. Mrs. Dalton had provided us with the master key and a hand-drawn map of the cellar system, her final contribution before Holmes had insisted she leave the college entirely, removing herself from whatever dangers the night might bring. Thornhill carried a dark lantern whose shuttered light could be opened or closed as needed, while I maintained my position as rear guard, my revolver drawn now and held ready, the weight of it familiar and oddly comforting in my hand. Professor Blackwood moved between us, his breathing audible in the confined space, his earlier fear giving way to a kind of resigned determination, as though he had accepted whatever fate the evening might deliver and decided to face it with what dignity remained available to him. The cellars opened before us in a series of vaulted chambers, each one supported by pillars whose capitals bore the weathered remains of medieval carving, foliage and faces and creatures, both sacred and profane, rendered by stonecutters dead for half a millennium. We passed through what must have once been wine storage, the walls still holding ancient racks, and then through a space that had clearly served as cold storage, its walls lined with shelves cut directly into the stone. At the far end of this chamber, partially hidden behind a wooden partition that had warped with age, we found the entrance to the sealed room that Blackwood had mentioned. The chapel undercroft, where the Silver Moth Society had conducted their final ritual. The door was modern, installed perhaps within the last century to secure what lay beyond, but it stood open now, the lock mechanism showing fresh marks where it had been expertly picked. Beyond the threshold, stone steps descended into absolute darkness, and from that darkness came the sound of voices, low, rhythmic, chanting words in medieval Latin that rolled and echoed through the ancient acoustics, like waves breaking on a distant shore. Holmes extinguished his candle and gestured for Thornhill to shutter the lantern completely, plunging us into a darkness so profound it seemed to have physical weight. We waited, allowing our eyes to adjust, and gradually I began to perceive a faint luminescence emanating from below, a cold silver light that pulsed in time with the chanting, growing brighter and dimmer in a rhythm that seemed to match the beating of my own heart. We descended with infinite care, each step tested before weight was committed, hands trailing along the wall for guidance and balance. The temperature dropped further, and I could see my breath now in the silver glow, small clouds of condensation that appeared and vanished like spirits themselves. The chanting grew louder as we approached, and I could make out individual voices now, perhaps a dozen people, their tones blending into a harmonic structure that was genuinely beautiful, despite its disturbing context. The chamber at the bottom of the stairs was circular, perhaps 30 feet in diameter, with a vaulted ceiling that rose to a central point marked by a carved silver moth, its wings spread in eternal flight. The walls were covered in medieval frescoes, faded but still visible in the strange light, images of transformation, of butterflies emerging from cocoons, of souls ascending from prostrate bodies, of silver rivers flowing upward toward celestial spheres. In the center of the room stood a silver bowl, large enough to hold several gallons of liquid, filled with what I assumed was the ink Blackwood had described, its surface reflecting the light from a dozen candles arranged in a perfect circle around it. Northcote's followers formed an outer ring, their faces hidden by hoods of dark cloth, their voices maintaining that hypnotic chant, and in the inner circle, dressed in a robe that appeared to be fashioned from actual silver thread, stood Northcote himself, his arms raised toward the ceiling, his face transformed by an expression of ecstatic conviction that was terrible to witness. Before him, seated in a high-backed chair that might have been 600 years old, sat Professor Edmund Blackwood, reconsidering deception and diverging plans, fictional plot structure. But as my eyes adjusted further to the silver light, I realized with a shock that the figure in the chair was not Blackwood at all. It was Professor Whitworth, his expression peaceful, his eyes closed, his hands resting palm upward on the chair's arms in a gesture of complete surrender. The real Blackwood stood beside me in the darkness, and I heard his sharp intake of breath as he recognized his colleague prepared for the transformation that Northcote had threatened. Holmes's hand on my shoulder stayed any movement I might have made toward intervention. We watched as Northcote's chanting reached a crescendo, as he dipped a silver brush into the bowl and approached Whitworth with slow, ceremonial steps. The candlelight caught the liquid on the brush, making it gleam with that peculiar luminescence. And as Northcote began to paint the moth symbol on Whitworth's forehead, I saw the old professor's lips move in silent recitation of the same chant. "Now," Holmes whispered, and Thornhill opened the lantern's shutter, flooding the chamber with ordinary yellow light that shattered the carefully constructed atmosphere of mystical inevitability. The chanting ceased abruptly. Hooded figures turned toward us in confusion and alarm. Northcote's hand froze mid-stroke, the brush dripping silver ink onto Whitworth's shoulder. And in that moment of disrupted concentration, Holmes's voice rang out with perfect clarity and devastating calm. "Sebastian Northcote, you are under arrest for the murders of Thomas Ashford and Catherine Holbrook, and for the attempted murder of Marcus Whitworth. Gentlemen and ladies of his misguided congregation, you are accessories to these crimes unless you remove yourselves from this chamber immediately and proceed to the college master's office, where the police are waiting to take your statements." For a long moment, nothing moved. The tableau held, Northcote with his silver brush, Whitworth in his chair, the hooded followers frozen in their circle. Then, one by one, the followers began to remove their hoods, revealing faces that ranged from young to old, educated to common, unified only by their expressions of dawning horror as Holmes's words penetrated the fog of belief that had brought them to this place. "You are wrong," Northcote said, his voice still carrying that terrible certainty. "The transformation is real. Thomas and Catherine proved it. Their consciousness continues in the silver vessels I showed you. Tonight, Marcus will join them, will achieve the immortality that—" "Will die," Holmes interrupted, descending the stairs into the chamber proper. "From acute silver poisoning, combined with the psychoactive effects of whatever plant alkaloids you have mixed into that ink. The visions your victims experienced were hallucinations induced by toxic exposure, not mystical transcendence. Their deaths were caused by cardiac arrest resulting from systemic poisoning, not spiritual transformation. You are not a mystic, Mr. Northcote. You are simply a murderer with delusions of profundity." He had reached the silver bowl now, and withdrew from his pocket a small vial of clear liquid, which he poured into the ink. Immediately, the silver surface began to bubble and foam, releasing a noxious vapour that made several of the nearby followers stumble backward, coughing. A simple reagent, Holmes explained, that demonstrates the presence of mercury and white lead in concentrations sufficient to cause severe neurological damage and cardiac failure. The Silver Moth Society did not achieve transcendence, Mr. Northcote. They died of poisoning 600 years ago in this very chamber, victims of their own misguided attempts to chemically induce spiritual experiences. I had moved to Whitworth's side and was checking his vital signs with practiced efficiency. His pulse was elevated but steady, his breathing shallow but regular. The silver ink on his forehead was still wet, easily wiped away with my handkerchief. "He has not yet ingested enough to cause permanent damage," I reported, though another few minutes and the absorption through the skin might have been sufficient to... A sudden crash interrupted my assessment as Northcote threw the silver brush against the wall, where it shattered into pieces, scattering droplets of toxic ink across the ancient frescoes. His face had transformed from ecstatic certainty to something darker, more desperate. "You understand nothing," he snarled, all pretense of cultured civility abandoned. "I have heard their voices, communed with those who have transcended. The silver vessels speak." "The silver vessels," Holmes said with clinical precision, "produce subtle sounds as the metal responds to temperature changes, sounds which your mind, primed by belief and expectation, interprets as voices. It is a phenomenon well documented in psychological literature, pareidolia applied to auditory rather than visual stimuli. You hear what you wish to hear, Mr. Northcote, and you have murdered to justify your delusions." The remaining followers were fleeing now, their footsteps echoing on the stone stairs as they scrambled toward escape, or perhaps toward the uncertain mercy of confession. Within moments, only our small group remained, Holmes and myself, Blackwood and Thornhill, the defeated Northcote, and the dazed but living Whitworth, who was beginning to stir in his chair, awareness returning to his eyes like a man waking from troubling dreams. From above came new sounds, heavy footfalls, authoritative voices, the arrival of the police, whom Holmes had summoned hours earlier, with telegrams sent from Cambridge. The investigation that would follow would be long and complex, I knew, unraveling the threads of belief and manipulation that had led educated people to participate in acts that rational examination revealed as nothing more than systematic poisoning disguised as mystical ritual. But in that moment, as the constables descended to take Northcote into custody, as Whitworth was helped to his feet and guided toward fresh air and medical attention, as the strange silver light of the candles was replaced by the ordinary warmth of police lanterns, I felt the mystery itself dissolving into the simpler truths that Holmes had always championed, that reason and observation could penetrate even the most elaborate veils of superstition, that human evil required no supernatural explanation, that the extraordinary was most often merely the ordinary viewed through the distorting lens of fear or desire. We emerged from the cellars into a college transformed by the night's events. Word had spread, and students and faculty gathered in small clusters, their voices low with speculation and shock. The police moved with efficient purpose, taking statements, securing evidence, beginning the methodical process of documentation. that would eventually result in justice served through courts rather than through the uncertain verdicts of mystical judgment. Holmes and I retreated to Blackwood's study as dawn began to paint the eastern sky with bands of rose and gold, the ancient stones of Cambridge catching the light and holding it like a promise that another day had come, that the world continued its turning despite the darkness that sometimes gathered in forgotten chambers beneath the earth. Mrs. Hudson would be wondering at our absence, I thought, and perhaps even now was preparing breakfast for our eventual return to Baker Street. "Thank you," Blackwood said simply, pouring tea with hands that had finally stopped trembling. "You saved not merely my life, but perhaps my soul, for if I had been forced through that ritual, I do not know if my mind could have survived what Whitworth endured." Holmes accepted his cup with a slight nod. "The mind is resilient, Professor, but you are correct that exposure to such concentrated toxins, combined with suggestion and expectation, might have produced effects difficult to recover from. Professor Whitworth was fortunate that we intervened when we did. A few more minutes, and Dr. Watson's prognosis might have been considerably less optimistic." Through the window, I could see the sun rising fully now, burning away the last wisps of mist, revealing the college in all its ancient beauty, stone and glass, and the patient endurance of institutions built to outlast the passions and delusions of any individual era. Somewhere a church bell rang, calling the faithful to morning prayer, and its sound seemed to cleanse the air of the night's lingering strangeness. Holmes must have sensed the direction of my thoughts, for he said quietly, "The desire to transcend our limitations is not in itself unreasonable, Watson. It is only the methods that became monstrous. Perhaps that is the true lesson of the Silver Moth Society, that the noblest aspirations, pursued without wisdom or restraint, can lead to the darkest outcomes." Outside, students were making their way to early lectures, their voices rising in familiar patterns of debate and laughter. Life reasserting itself with the resilience that Holmes had spoken of. I felt sleep beginning to claim me, the exhaustion of the long night finally making itself known, and I knew that soon we would make our way to the station, board the London train, return to those comfortable rooms on Baker Street, where this strange adventure had begun. But before sleep could take me completely, I wanted to hold on to this moment a little longer. The peace of morning, the satisfaction of mystery solved, the quiet triumph of reason over delusion. These were the gifts that my long association with Sherlock Holmes had brought me, and I was grateful for them, grateful for all the adventures we had shared, and would yet share in the years to come. And so, dear friend, we come to the end of this particular tale, this journey through gaslit mysteries and the shadows that gather in forgotten places. I hope it has served its purpose, that it has helped to quiet your thoughts, to ease you into that peaceful realm where consciousness gives way to dreams. If you have found comfort in this story, if you have enjoyed traveling with us through these nocturnal adventures, I invite you to subscribe to this channel, to press that small button that will bring you more such tales whenever you need them. Leave a like if the silver moths have whispered gently enough to help you drift towards sleep, and perhaps share this with others who might find solace in these atmospheric mysteries. The night is ending now, giving way to the gentle light of morning, and I wish you the deepest, most restful sleep, filled with dreams of Victorian streets and cosy fires and mysteries that resolve themselves into the peaceful certainty of reason triumphant. Good night, dear listener, may you wake refreshed and renewed, ready to face whatever ordinary or extraordinary adventures your own life may bring. The silver moths have been banished by the dawn, and you are safe, you are warm, you are drifting now into the kindest darkness, where rest awaits with patient arms. Sleep well, and dream of mysteries solved and stories yet to be told.